Welcome everyone. Great to be here and to go through a very important portion, the portion of Shoftim, which speaks about leadership and the responsibility of leadership, and as we said, even accountability that we expect from leadership. Let's go through the summary, and then we'll go through some of the messages that we can take from it. So this week, we talk about the fact that we have to appoint fair judges who are going to be accountable in their position of authority in every city in Israel. So not just the Supreme Courts that are removed from the people, you have to be within the people. Come back to that point. Capital punishment is prescribed for idolatry, as various idolatrous practices are banned. Then we're told to bring sacrifice to Hashem. It has to be free of any blemish. Must follow the rulings of the Sanhedrin and the oral law of your day. Not every generation has the same level of authority in the Beth Din or Sanhedrin. So it says, Asher Yerucha, by whatever is the authority at that time, you have to follow them. Moshe instructs Bnei Israel, BNY, Bnei Israel, to coronate a king after they enter. So we've had legal authority. Now we're going to talk about regal kingship. And it too has to be very accountable for all of the authority that is invested in it. A Jewish king may not amass excessive amounts of horses, may not have too many wives, may not have personal wealth. He writes 2 Sefer Torah. We'll come back to that point. Every Jew is commanded to have a Sefer Torah, and we try and participate to make sure that we all have a Sefer Torah, but a king has to have 2. One remains with him at all times, constant reminder that he remain humble and follow Hashem's law. He's not above the law, a king. Then one remains, the Kohanim were chosen by God. So now we've got a third area of authority. We've got judicial authority, we've got the monarchy, and now we've got spiritual leadership, the Kohanim, chosen by Hashem to be his holy servants. They do not receive an inheritance in the land of Israel. Hashem is their inheritance. The Kohanim receive lots of different types of gifts. They are spelt out exactly which gifts are given, from meat, from different tithes, crop, wool. A Kohen may always come to the temple and personally offer his own sacrifice. Although there were specific weeks and rosters of when a Kohen was on duty, he could choose to come at other times as well. It was his prerogative. There's the prohibition against divination, fortune telling, all of these occult practices. We'll come back to that as well. We are commanded to rather put our faith and trust in Hashem himself and his prophets. Don't deal with these other supposed centers of power or influence. Moshe then instructs that 3 cities of refuge be set up for the inadvertent murderer. We've had that theme before. Somebody kills somebody else by mistake. The family might want to take vengeance. The processes of doing teshuvah, even though it was done by mistake, to go to a city of refuge and to be there until the Kohen Gadol passes away. And then when the borders expand with the coming of Mashiach, add another 3 cities of refuge. In fact, the commentaries say this is one of the real places that the era of Mashiach is alluded to, because it says that there will come a time when the boundaries will be opened up. That time never came. These cities were never built. It'll be built when the time of Mashiach comes. It's one of the concrete consequences when Mashiach comes, is that we're going to be having these additional cities of refuge. Then a conviction for capital or corporal punishment requires a minimum of 2 witnesses. Al pi shnayim eidim. You need 2 witnesses. What happens if you have a false witness who wants to cause harm to another person and swears and then gives testimony falsely that could cause another person, for example, to have to be deprived of money or even be put to death? And then it was discovered that the false witnesses weren't even there. They were fabricated, this whole thing. So the punishment is whatever they intended to be done to the person about whom they gave testimony is done to them. If they sought that a death penalty be brought against another Jew, it is inflicted on them. If they sought that the fine of thousands of rands, then it's brought on them. Change subjects, we now talk about battle. And before we go to battle, which is a very physical power, you need to have strong soldiers, but look who's involved. The Kohen admonishes the troops not to fear the enemy. So there's immediately a spiritual correlation between war and the being connected to ourselves, our inner selves, to Hashem. Then it speaks about exemptions. Who doesn't go to military duty? We'll come back to this point. Somebody who was recently married, somebody who built a new home, or a person who is innately very fearful and afraid and scared of what consequences could come of war. So we're worried that he's going to cause other people to become fearful too. And therefore we send him home rather. But it only applies in certain cases. We'll come back to that. Before waging war, we're commanded to make a peaceful overture to the enemy. So we're not looking to destroy. We're actually looking to find some peaceful solution. And then in the middle of all of this, we are taught that we are forbidden to cut down a fruit tree because we're in the middle of a siege or battle, and you might have to be killing people in war. That's what happens in war. But ki ha'et adam etz hasadeh is the tree like man, is man like the tree of the field. So if we have to deal with human beings and even cause death, it doesn't license us to do wanton destruction. And it's very important, we'll come back to this point, the context in which we are told to preserve the world, to look after it, to ensure that the ecology and everything about preserving the future of the world is, we do our utmost to do so. And it's taught to us in the context of war. What a strange place to find it in the Torah, and the Rambam Maimonides, when he teaches these laws, likewise, he puts these laws into the laws of war. And then finally, it speaks about a very strange practice, debated amongst the Rishonim, the greats of the commentaries, whether what exactly category it fell into, was it considered a sacrifice or not. But what happens is that a person is found dead between two cities. Nobody knows how the person met their death. So they measure from the cities that are closest to this person who's deceased, and the town that is nearest is identified. The elders of that town have to emerge from their town, go to the place of the murder, and they say, Yadeinu lo shafchu et adam hazeh, our hands did not spill this blood. These are like the great rabbis of the city, have to stand up and say this text. We did not slay this person. So I want to come back to this fact that we talk about accountability in different realms of power and authority, the judiciary, the monarchy, the spiritual leaders of the Kohanim. And right at the end of this portion, which sandwiches many, many details, some of which we're going to go through now, it ends off with the accountability of leadership to deal with the loss of life, and that it is everybody's problem. One doesn't hide behind the walls of one city and say, I don't know, and it's not my problem. It becomes the problem of the nearest city. And we'll discuss why it is that they have to make the speech. We didn't spill this blood. Who would think that the rabbis of the nearest town had gone out and killed somebody in the obviously not, but what were they needing to say that? Let's go through some of the specific details that are presented and see how we can relate them to our own eyes. Very beautifully, the Sifsei Kohen says, literally the words say, judges and officers. Judges are the judiciary, officers are the police force, the executive of the judiciary. You shall place at all your city gates. That's the simple meaning. Comes the Sifsei Kohen and he says, you know that there are many gates that each of us have. The human body is a city, and it has 7 gates. We have 2 eyes, 2 ears, that's 4, 2 nostrils is 6, a mouth is 7. And beyond the obvious meaning of this verse, it's saying, Shoftim v'shotrim, be judicious and have a powerful force that is able to ensure that our mouths, our ears, our nostrils, our eyes are controlled. They're under control. Place internal judges to discriminate and regulate what should be admitted and what should be kept out. And officers to enforce whatever the judge's decision is, to make sure that we actually get control of the gates of our own inner city. You and me, we're each a city, and we have all of these capabilities. Are we utilizing them for positive? Are we ensuring that we're reining in the power of speech and the power of sight and all of these different powers so that they're reserved for good and never, God forbid, to cause harm? So we have gates, our own personal gates. Now, the second completely different commentary, which is going back to the literal meaning of this verse, that we need to appoint judges. There has to be honest judges, a judiciary that is accountable, and there has to be a police force that is accountable. But look what it says. The literal meaning put for you, he translates it here, judges and officers shall you place, or you shall place at the city's gates. But literally the Hebrew wording is Shoftim, B'shotrin, Titen lecha, which literally means place for you. Not that you should place, but place for you at your gates. Commentaries explain that the people appointing the judges are subject to the judges. The people that are appointing the police force are accountable to the police. There's nobody that stands higher than the law. There is no authority whatsoever that can say this is the law for everybody else. Like, everybody else has to wear masks, but because we are important, we don't have to wear masks, right? Doesn't go well. Everyone has to be accountable to whatever rule we're putting in. And nobody stands higher than the law. Nobody. Isn't it unbelievable that we're going to talk about all these different powers in society, and each of them is going to have accountability to ensure that it has checks and balances. Nobody gets carried away with their own power. Not the judges on their own, not the police officers on their own, not the Kohanim, the priests, the rabbis, the spiritual leaders on their own, not the king. Everybody is subject to the authority of Torah. And here, if Torah is telling you how to set up judges and judiciary and all the things that require the legal boundaries that govern mankind, Titen lecha, place it for you. You who are appointing has to know that you too are accountable to the authorities that you are establishing. Staying on the same theme, it's very interesting to see. We already said subject to the law, but furthermore, it says judges before police officers. Look at the order, judges and police officers. So the Rabbi explains very beautifully that in the process of setting up the environment that creates a safe society, judges have to come before police officers, meaning judges teach the law, they determine the law. That is an instructive, educational process. This, the officers, is the executive that enforce the law. Don't enforce before you have clarified what it is that you're enforcing. Police can only be there after you have defined the extent of law. Otherwise, you have a police state, and police get carried away with themselves. It could be as dangerous as not having police is having police who are not in control and are not subject to the constitution or to the legal requirements of the country. So the Rebbe says, very importantly, judges come first. Judges teach the law. And so it should be in every environment that we discipline, in a school, in a home, parents who are disciplining children. So the enforcing of law and order and discipline is important. But it has to follow a process of educating, identifying, clarifying what it is that is required of these children or of these adults or this workplace or the shul or whatever it is. So we need the judges teaching, and then the officers are able to enforce that. And finally, the Rebbe gives in a completely different context, says it's interesting that we have two concepts in this week's reading. We have judges that have to be appointed, and there it says, B'chol sha'arecha, in all your gates, in all your cities, you have to have judges. Judges don't judge in Jerusalem only, and then if you live in Haifa, or if you live in Rosh Hanikra and in Eilat, then you have to be subject to the judges in Jerusalem. You need to have judges in each of those cities. Why is that so important? Because a judge has to know the environment, that whatever is taking place, where is it taking place? What are the conditions of that environment? If a person is aloof and is in a Jerusalem environment, you cannot understand the issues of Johannesburg. You need to have a judiciary, a Beis Din, that is housed in Johannesburg, because they will know what the people's issues are. They will know what we grapple with and what is uniquely South African. So it is very important that judges are in each of the cities so that the judge can relate to each person within the city, knowing what it is that they are contending with in their environment. Even if you're outside of Israel, you have to have judges in the cities outside of Israel. Contrast that with the cities of refuge. A person killed inadvertently. He now has to run to a city of refuge. Where are those cities of refuge placed? Only in Israel. Why is that? Because now that you're trying to rectify a terrible event, a person killed somebody inadvertently. He didn't intend to knock somebody down in his car. It was a complete mistake. But nevertheless has to go through a process of rectifying their life and bringing their life in order again. They need to move from their place. Now it's not good to stay where you are. You need to go to Israel. And Israel represents a spiritual growth and development. It represents holiness. You have to detach yourself, unhook yourself from the environment that might have been the context that caused this terrible event to take place. So look at the contrast. For judgment, you need to be in the city so that no judge is judging from a distance, even when Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, when Hashem says to Abraham, I'm going to judge Sodom, he says, I'm going to go down now and I'm going to see the cries and the shouts that are coming from Sodom. I'm going to go down, says Hashem. And the commentaries explain Hashem's everywhere. He doesn't have to go up or down or anywhere. He doesn't have to go anywhere. He's teaching us. You want to assess the extent of the crime? Go there. Be involved with the people so you understand the context in which that crime took place. Even when Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, when the golden calf was being formed, and Hashem says, Lech reid, go down to your people. Yeah, you have to be amongst the people when you're dealing with a problem. But the person who has a problem, he can't just stay as he is, or as she is. You have to move. You have to go to Israel, to a city of refuge, not one that's set out for you in each of your little towns. No, here you have to go on a trek. You have to, if you need change, if you need to develop your life, you have to move. You have to detach yourself from the environment that contributed to the sin that happened, even if it was inadvertent. Now we say, what are the conditions? How is this accountability preserved? So the first thing is that when you appoint judges, you must make sure that they do not take a bribe. He says, because the bribery, ya'aver einei, it'll blind the eyes of the wise, chachamim, and it'll pervert the words of the just. Bribery has the capacity to undo objectivity and clarity of thought. That's what a bribe does. Now, as soon as the judge accepts a bribe from a litigant, it's impossible for him to be favorably disposed, not to be favorably disposed towards him, says Rashi, and that's why a bribe is a terrible thing. But we would need to see that a bribery is not only what happens when you meet a police officer or traffic officer and you've been speeding, and then you reach for your wallet, God forbid, and you think that that's how you solve the solution. Bribery is not only by handing over cash. Bribery can happen in many, many different ways. Sometimes it could be a favor. Sometimes it could be speaking well on your behalf and you feel indebted to the person. So it's not just a cash, it's not only in kind, items that you might have been enriched by, but if you in any way feel accountable, responsible, you feel that you need to return a favor, you are no longer in a position to judge that case objectively. And my father always used to say that when it came to the daughters of Tzlafchad, who came to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they asked a very, very objective question, that our father died, he had no sons, the only offspring are daughters, and why should we lose the lot of our father? Can we not inherit, even though inheritance normally goes to sons, but there are no sons? We want to ensure that the property of our father is not going to be lost. So we want to find out if we could inherit. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, I'm going to ask Hashem what the answer is. Now Moshe Rabbeinu knew the Torah. He was asked numerous questions. Why suddenly, when it came to the daughters of Tzlafchad, he wasn't sure of the answer and he had to go and ask God. what the answer was. My father used to say, because when the daughters of Tzlafchad came to Moshe Rabbeinu, they added in extraneous information. Yes, our father died, he had no sons. We want to know if we as daughters can inherit. But then they added in the words, V'hu lo haya ba'adat Korach. He was not in the congregation of Korach, your nemesis, the one who rebelled against you, Moshe Rabbeinu. Our father was on your side, Moses. He stood for you in that whole debate, in that whole rebellion. And Moshe Rabbeinu, my father used to say, for the subtlety of them saying details that were not actually needed for the information. It was information that was extraneous. It wasn't required to be able to find an answer. Once Moshe Rabbeinu heard them saying, and our father was on your side, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe said, I'm disqualified. I can't give an answer. I'm going to God. I'm going to ask God what the answer is. Because as soon as we feel indebted to somebody, we lose our objectivity and our clarity. And nobody is immune to that. You need to know, we need to know that we should never ever overestimate our objectivity when we have a feeling that we need to repay somebody as favor. We're no longer in a position to assess something and to deal with it objectively. So bribery is something that we got to make sure is removed out. The bunim of pshischa. This is a very famous concept, where in setting up the judiciary, it says, tzedek tirdoiv, justice shall you pursue. Why does it have to say justice twice? So the bunim of pshischa says, justice means that with justice shall you pursue justice, meaning that both the end and the means by which it is obtained must be just. We're not only pursuing justice, and therefore at any cost, whatever it is, we trample on everything because we believe in a cause. The method of achieving the cause has to be just as the cause is. Beautiful. I mean, we have in the history of the world and politics of the world, we talk of Machiavellianism, where the opposite was taught. The stronger make sure to endure, and you rule, and you can manipulate, and you can mislead, and there's nothing wrong in telling lies in order to achieve what we believe is an important objective. If the objective is good, then however it is obtained, that's fine. Machiavellianism. That is how politicians often deal with life. We lose sight of justice in our pursuit of justice. And in our terminology in the Gemara, it's basically mitzvah haba ba'aveira. If a person thinks that you can do a mitzvah by doing an aveira, as for example, a person steals and then goes with that which he has been enriched through theft, and he says, I want to make a big donation to the temple, I want to go and make a big donation to a good cause. And with that, I've elevated the money. Yeah, I stole it. Yeah, but look at a good guy I am. I'm using it for good. So however that is, a person takes anything and then goes ahead and does a mitzvah with it. You steal somebody's lulav on Sukkot, and then you go and shake it and give it piously. You got to be very careful that the ends do not justify the means. The means have to be kosher. We have to have kosher goals, but we have to have kosher means by which we achieve them. Very important part of our accountability to the justice system. And then it speaks about the king. So we've spoken about the realm, the authority of justice, of the judiciary, and how it is accountable. Let's move on to the next seat of power. And these are all checks and balances against one another. The king is subject to law. The law is subject to the king. So there are checks and balances to ensure that nobody stands above. And now specifically, and it will be when he sits upon his throne that he will write for himself, not one, 2 copies of this Torah on a scroll. You and me and all the plebs of the world have to write one Torah. And if we can't write a whole Torah, we buy a letter in a Torah, very important. All of our children should own a letter in a Torah. Why is that the method that we are able to write the Torah? Because even if we can't write the whole Torah, the Torah is incomplete if one letter is missing. And if we paid or wrote the one letter in the Torah, we brought that Torah to completion by virtue of that letter. So in a sense, we own the Torah. or we have ownership in that Torah. Every Jew has to write a Torah. We have an ownership in Torah. But a king needs two. The king has two Torah scrolls. One that is placed in the treasury, in the inner chambers, and one that goes with him when he comes and when he goes and wherever he walks. The king is carrying a Sefer Torah. Why do we put that extra burden on a king? Average guy doesn't have to walk around with a Sefer Torah. We can leave it in the ark at Shul, and it's safe and sound, and we lock the ark, and then we know the Torah is there when we need it. A king has to walk around. That 1 year, one put away in his treasury, one he walks around with. Why? Why does a king, more than anybody else, have to have a Torah? So this is about accountability. A king has power, has immense power. An individual who is disrespectful to the king in the smallest way could be liable to be put to death. That's how powerful a king is. But the power of a king is subject to the power of God. The day that a king forgets that it's Torah that is empowering him, so he doesn't have the power of a king. He because he has more power than anybody else, he needs to know more, remind himself more often than anyone else, that I am here only by the grace of what Torah says. I'm subject to the Torah, I have to keep the Torah mitzvahs. I cannot ever say that because of my power, this doesn't apply to me. It definitely does. So we have accountability of a king to the judiciary, but even a king to himself. We're now moving on to a totally different subject, and it says, Tamim tiyeh Hashem Elokecha, you should be Tamim. Tamim is pure or wholehearted. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, says from this verse we learn that the general context of the statement, being pure with God, being wholehearted with God, is the other prohibitions that are listed there. No fortune telling, no dependency on mazolos, no looking to how you are controlled by the signs of the zodiac. So conduct yourself with him, with Hashem, with simplicity. Depend on him. Do not seek to manipulate the future. Rather accept whatever happens to you with simplicity, and then you will be with Hashem. So we learn from here, I said over here, Jews deal with top management. Just like Jews never buy retail. Why would you want to buy retail? You go to the source. You go to where it comes from. Because we deal with the top management. And when it comes in life, our top management is Hashem. Hashem put lots of powers into this world. They are subject to Hashem. Yes, the sun is a power, and the moon is a power, and the signs of the zodiac are a power, but we are never controlled by it. And the more credulence and importance we place on forces that Hashem put into the world in isolation of God, the more we ruin our lives by becoming a product of and subject to that. So, for example, this is a whole shir in its own right, but we say in Mazel Yisrael, there's no such thing as mazel to a Jew. A Jew has an order of reward and punishment and choices and Hashem. But nevertheless, we do actually know that there is certain degrees of mazel. There are certain months that are associated with good mazel and certain months that are associated with misfortune. The month of Adar, which is the Purim month, is associated with good fortune. The month of Av, which is Tisha B'Av month, destruction of the temple, is associated with loss and pain and suffering, and even the signs of the zodiac. What is the sign of the zodiac for the month of Av, which is the destruction of the temple? It is Leo. It is the lion, the carnivore, the destructive force that can ruin. And what's the sign of the zodiac of the month of Pesach, for example? It is Aries, because everything about Pesach centered around the lamb and the bringing of the lamb. And what's the sign of the month of Tishrei? It's Libra, which is the scales. What scales got to do with Rosh Hashanah? Well, scales have everything to do with Rosh Hashanah. Has everything to do with scales. So there is a correlation between energies that God put into the world. But this is where we depart from fatalism and believing that there is control beyond our choices. It is like, I think a good analogy, it's like the weather. You could say on a bad day, life is going to be affected by the rain. First, I'm going to have to wear a raincoat, I'm going to have to walk around with an umbrella, and I'm not going to be able to sit outside and enjoy it. I will be affected by the weather. And if it's freezing cold, I'm going to be wearing things over my ears, and I'm going to be wearing a scarf. We're affected by the weather. If it's boiling hot, we're going to need it. We're affected. Affected does not mean controlled. Nobody can stand up and say, the weather was bad, and that's why I made the moral choice that I did. I chose to be manipulative and deficient in honesty in my business practices because the weather was bad. We'd all laugh at the person. Yes, weather affects us, it doesn't control our choices. So as Jews, we believe that there are forces that God put into the world, and they are very powerful, and they can actually affect our lives, but never affect us to the point that we are controlled by them. And that's why we say, Tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. Be pure with God. Deal with top management. Stand and daven to Hashem. The more you start dealing with fortune telling and this force and this occult purpose, and this one was able to connect with souls, and this one brought people back from heaven, and they foretold what was going to happen, the more we give credulence to that, the more we invest ourselves into lower management, which is only there by virtue of the power of Hashem. We daven to Hashem. We have a problem, we deal with God. We do another mitzvah. We connect ourselves with Hashem. We do not connect ourselves to any of these extraneous matter. Tamim means be wholehearted with Hashem, and with that you can exclude, and there's no exception given to imagine that there's a power independent of God or able to operate independent of God. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Everything is part of God. We deal with top management. Okay, it's just interesting. We spoke about the context in which certain mitzvahs are presented to us, and sometimes it is totally counterintuitive. I'll give you a few examples. This is one of them. So when you besiege a city for many days to wage a war against it, to capture it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them, for you may eat of them, the trees, and you may not destroy them. Why would this be in the area of battle, of war? You could imagine that in the laws that relate to brachot, blessings that are recited on produce, it would be appropriate to talk about trees in the context of the agricultural section of the Torah, and it doesn't. It talks about them in the context of war. Because sometimes God presents things so counterintuitively that we infer from the place in which that mitzvah is placed to what extent it matters. What it's saying is that even in war, even when blood is spilling, when life is cheap, because you're at war, don't lose sight of preserving Hashem's planet. Do what you have to do because war requires it of you. But that doesn't give you license to go out and destroy everything in the world around you. I'll give you another example. You know that it's very important to bring a person to burial. God forbid, it is a terrible, terrible thing. If a person decides that they're going to be cremated, it is a terrible consequence on the neshama. It's the absolute part of our belief that a person is taken from the earth, is brought back to the earth, and is brought to burial. And then it says that should happen as soon as possible. It should happen the same day. In Yerushalayim, they bury the same day, even if it's at 11 o'clock at night. I've been to such funerals in the middle of the night. They will never allow a body to remain overnight, not for any reason whatsoever. It's the custom in Jerusalem. But even in South Africa, the burial should happen the same day. If it's delayed a day, it's not good, but it might be necessary for whatever reason. If a family member, like a child, is coming from overseas and it's therefore a respect to the dead, we can wait. Never more than 3 days. Where do we learn that law? How do we know that the physical body of a person deceased is still, it requires respect and has to be treated with the utmost of respect and brought to burial as soon as possible? What's the context that God tells us that? If the person was sentenced to death, what kind of person sentenced to death? The Beis Din is called a murderous Beis Din if a death sentence was passed once in 70 years. That is how far away we were from passing death sentences. And it happened. The guy was sentenced to death. What kind of guy gets sentenced to death? A person who really, really misbehaved. And then it says that his body should be brought to burial the same day. That's who we're told about has to be brought to burial. Respect for a physical body of whom? Of a criminal. Why does the Torah tell us that in that particular context? Because from there we learn kal vachomer, how much more so. If a criminal's body has to be so respected, somebody who needed to be put to death, that's how bad their situation was. We're taught we have to respect their physical body. What about a regular person who's not a criminal? How much more so? So sometimes the Torah teaches you something in such an extreme situation, and this is one of them over here. Where does it teach us? As Maimonides, Rambam, teaches that this whole concept of not destroying things, not to be a destructive human being, it's called Baal Tashchis. It's a very specific law against being destructive. Not to break vessels, not to tear clothes, not to demolish buildings, not to cause a spring to be stopped up or dispose of food in a ruinous manner. It's called Baal Tashchis. Don't be a destructive human being. Value items that God put in this world. If you don't value things around you, you've lost the value of life. And somebody who transgresses prohibition of lo tashchis is a very serious prohibition. And we learn these laws from laws like, do not cut down the fruit tree. Yes, you can eat of the fruit. Yes, you can take as much of the fruit as you want. Don't cut down the tree, because tomorrow you won't have fruit. You can utilize the world. Use the water of the world and the resources of the world and all of the things that Hashem gave, the bounty of Hashem's grace in this world, Hashem gave to us to use. Don't abuse it. Don't abuse it to the point that you cause destruction to Hashem's world. We have no right to do it, not even to our own bodies, not to anything. Where do we learn not to be destructive from? An environment and situation that is the most destructive situation in life, and that is war. So it's counterintuitive. Hashem specifically tells us the sensitivity not to destroy in a time where we're most destructive, so that we'll know in a regular situation how much more so should I respect God's world and not do anything that is, that's what I'm saying, the context is counterintuitive. Now we got the case of war, where we're told that there's certain people who are sent home. For example, a person who's faint-hearted, let him go and return home, and let him not destroy the resolve of his brothers. You know what it's like when everyone's having to hold the line, and suddenly you get a whole lot of people saying, we're out of here, no, we're not going to make it, we're going to start running, and they leave their boots in the sand. It normally has a repercussion that other people start leaving their boots in the sand as well. When you start running, you cause panic. People have a capacity to do that, not only in war. When we talk negatively about anything, when we talk negatively about the situation, and yes, there's so much that can be said negatively about the coronavirus and about pandemics and about looting in South Africa, we can get carried away. But what we have to be accountable for is that if we talk negatively, we undo the resolve of others. We have no right to do that. If we need to find strength in ourselves, don't go and ruin it for somebody else. And it's a terrible crime. And it precipitates it. So that's how we say, if you are faint-hearted, go home, gaya heim. Because if you're going to stick around over here, and in the critical hour when everyone has to literally stand up and be brave, and you're going to be running, you're going to cause everyone to be disheartened. But now comes an interesting fact. It doesn't apply to all wars. It applies to wars where boundaries are being expanded, where there is a need for the king to wage a war for whatever reason it is. But if it's an existential war, as is the case in Israel, every war Israel has fought has not been, as the world would want to read into it, an attempt to broaden our boundaries and to become imperialistic forces. We fought wars to ensure that our family in Israel survive, that we have a place called Israel. It's called the Israel Defense Force, not for any smaller reason than the fact that if there wasn't a defense force, there wouldn't be an Israel. So if it's an existential war, where you're fighting literally for survival, we don't send the guy home. It's only in a different kind of war. But in a war where it's a matter of life and death for the whole country, nobody goes home. So the question is, why is it relevant to faint-heartedness? If we're saying that somebody faint-hearted is going to run in the critical moment and cause others to want to run, So how does it make a difference if it's this kind of war or that kind of war? In fact, if it's an existential war where we're fighting for our very existence, then it matters more. We should care more that we do not dishearten the hearts of our brothers. So why in that case does he not get sent home and he's told to stay at the border? And this is a whole shir in its own right as well. But very briefly, people behave differently when it's a matter of life and death. We sometimes think we don't have the strength. And that's because what is at stake is peripheral to our existence. But in a moment where we realize that this is a matter of life and death, not just one of those extras, added dimensions to life that we're fighting for, but we're fighting for survival, people are known. There was a case where a woman literally picked up the weight of a car off a child. Nobody knew how she had the strength to do that, because she was driven by inner strengths that transcended all of any boundaries whatsoever. People in moments of absolute life and death are known to have the strength to do things that would never normally have on a regular Monday morning. So what we're saying over here is that there are different wars. Let's take it out of the battle of soldiers with guns. We all fight wars. We all fight battles. Sometimes we're fighting for added fringe benefits. The battle of economy and the battle at work. We have many wars that we have to fight. Then there are things that literally go to the core. What's my child going to be? Is an existential battle. Is my child going to be an honest human being? Is the education of my child going to be something that is going to bring this child to make a positive difference in this world? My moral fiber, my spiritual state as a Jew, those are existential things. The battle that I have in order to be fit and to be strong and to be all of those things, are important as they are. They don't go to the core. So what this is telling us is that, the guy who's faint-hearted can be faint-hearted in a situation where he's not quite sure if he wants to fight for it in the first place. Maybe I don't need to fight for this. I give up. I'll go home. If he's got no place to go to, that's called home. If he's fighting on the boundary, because if he doesn't fight, there is no home. Then we're not worried about the faint-hearted. There is no faint-hearted. So sometimes our resolve to battle is not so much how strong we are and how developed we are, but how much we value the battle. Which battle is it? What is the essential battle of our life? If we define the battle as being a matter of life and death to me, then we have strengths that are way beyond what we can see when we look at ourselves normally. We have energies and strengths that can literally take us to another realm completely. Interesting definition of battle. And we said that we end with an accountability. We started talking about accountability, and this is an incredible story. We said, somebody dies outside on the highway, and we measure and we say, well, is it nearer to Pretoria or nearer to Johannesburg? Nearer to Johannesburg? Okay, the Beis Din has to go out now, and they have to say, we did not spill this blood. So the Gemara asks in the Tractate of Sota, would it enter anyone's mind that the elders of the courts were murderers? Why are they speaking about we didn't kill? Of course they didn't kill. Rather, they declare, we did not see him and let him depart without food and escort. Were we as leaders putting enough things in place to ensure that a person who left the town left with security, left with food, left with the wherewithal that the person would not be murdered? It's a horrific thing. Somebody died. Who's accountable? How did it happen? How did society allow for this to happen? So the representatives of society, the authority, the spiritual authority, not one of them would be eligible to even think of spilling blood, but stands up and says, this is what leadership means. If a terrible thing happened, what role could we have played that could have averted this terrible problem? How can we make new rules, new decrees, new goals that are going to ensure that something like this never happens again? And as the Rebbe points out, very, very importantly, that a person's in the city, he can say, it's not my problem. I have, my mandate is the Great Park Shul. That's my problem. This thing happened, there's a different shul. It's not my issue at all. This is a part of the community that has nothing to do with me. I'm the rabbi of this shul. I'm the father of this family. I am in charge of this workplace. This is not my problem. The fact that there's problems in the Tel, we live in Gauteng. That kind of headspace does not allow for society to extricate themselves from the horrific events that could unfold. So there needs to be accountability. We started with accountability. We end this portion by saying leadership has to look at an event and not say, as the passengers on a flight don't feel good when the captain comes out of the cockpit carrying a parachute or wearing a parachute and saying, I'm going out to get help. Nobody feels good on that plane, because that's not what you want to hear. You want to hear that a leader is with you. He's there to make sure that it's happening. And if all of us would aspire to be the leaders that are accountable, that have a commensurate responsibility for any area of authority that we have, then the world would look a much, much better place. We have to be accountable outside of our perceived limited domain. We're not the rabbi of this inner city. We are the person responsible in some way for what happened on the highway outside my city. And if all the political leadership in the country and all of the politicians would do this, we'd have a completely different South Africa and a different world. And please God, Mashiach will come. Thank you, everybody, for listening. So special to have these moments together. And let this week and the Shabbos and everything just be filled with joy and happiness. Thank you for all the guys I didn't welcome, Lynette and Neil and Basil and Philip. Thank you for joining, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. No, thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
A beautiful Shabbos.
Bye.
Thank you, Morris.
Bye.
Shalom, Mevorach.